Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our second in an 8-part series entitled Crafting Conversations, Discourses on the Craft Heritage of the Islamic World, Past, Present, and Future. Please note that this session is being recorded. This series is hosted by the Islamic Art and Material Culture Collaborative, the IAMCC, a new research network that brings together the capacities and resources of the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, the Aga Khan Museum, and the Royal Ontario Museum. I'm Dr. Fahmida Suleman, Curator of Islamic Art and Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada. My co-host today is Dr. Ruba Kana'an, the Assistant Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the Department of Visual Studies at the University of Toronto, who is also one of the IAMCC's founding members. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to begin with our Canadian land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that our institutions sit on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. I am delighted to introduce you to OmarJoseph Nasser-Khoury, an anti-fashion designer from East Jerusalem, Palestine. Omar studied art and design at London's Camberwell College of Art before graduating with a BA at the London College of Fashion in Fashion, Design, and Technology in 2010. Omar also holds a master's degree in social anthropology from Goldsmiths University, part of the University of London. Since 2011, he has exhibited his work in England and Palestine, and 2 of his works have been acquired by the British Museum. Over the years, he has worked closely with the British Museum in researching its vast collection of Palestinian dress. He's worked with the Edward Said National Conservatory of Music, was a lecturer at Birzeit University, and has curated exhibitions at the Birzeit University Museum on their Palestinian dress and jewelry collections. He has also worked closely with charitable organizations such as Inash in Beirut and Sunbula. His most recently co-authored publication, 17 Embroidery Techniques from Palestine, an instruction manual published by Sunbula in 2019, is something that he will speak to us as part of today's session. The title of our conversation today is Embroidery from Palestine, Disciplining the Past to Craft the Future. The conversation will last for 1 hour, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. I encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screens during the session. And I have disabled the chat, if that's all right with everybody. So now I will hand over to Omar and to Ruba. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahmida.
Thank you so much, Fahmida, for this introduction. And thank you, Omar, for taking part in this wonderful series. I think for those of us working in the historical aspect of arts and crafts, always love hearing people working with contemporary artists and contemporary craftspeople, because we learn so much about how the practices, and it gives us an idea of how to be able to interpret the past. We really appreciate you being here. But I think before we start the conversation about Palestinian embroidery, Fahmida introduced you as an anti-fashion designer. And I would love you to explain to us, what do you mean by anti-fashion designer? How is that reflected in your work?
Okay, I can start with explaining that, but just before, Fahmida mentioned I worked with the Edward Said National Conservatory of Music. That was a very long time ago and a very brief commission, so it doesn't really count. Although I'm proud to be a student, not a very successful one, but I was a student. Okay. So I'd like to start by saying that I am dedicating this talk to the memory of my great aunt from Birzeit, who was basically my kind of entry into this world from a very, very early age. And it was kind of her stories and input that kind of give me that sense of history in which I work. So answering your question, anti-fashion is basically a fashion that consciously and actively rejects the kind of mainstream capitalist standards of fashion. So fashion, in my opinion, and based on my research and understanding, is a mode of production. I see fashion as a mode of production, and particularly as a capitalist mode of production. So anti-fashion, in my case, is a consciously anti-capitalist endeavor of dressmaking that takes into consideration the work of many anti-fashion designers before me and around me. And I will explain that by showing some examples of anti-fashion designers and generally my work. So for some people who aren't aware, anti-fashion started as a term in Europe around, mainly people say it's about the 90s, but before that with Vivienne Westwood and her shop Sex at the King's Road in London, where she kind of incorporated punk aesthetics, which were consciously rejecting the kind of mainstream British standards of style, standards of beauty, success, and so forth. And then you had trends in the 90s, and especially after the AIDS crisis in the 80s and after, that kind of looked at the body in a radically different way, and the way that fashion looks at the body as a kind of healthy, beautiful, something to be desired, and completely inflected that. You can see that in the case of Kate Moss, when she was pioneered as the kind of face of fashion back in the early 2000s, late 1990s. In terms of Palestine, there's a very interesting anti-fashion project or brand going on called Trashy Clothing, founded by Shukri Lawrence in 2017. This is a kind of excerpt from their video. And they kind of take on kitsch and a local kitsch style, and they embrace it and they recreate it as part of their kind of, their also conscious rejection of the ideals of beauty that have been set by the mainstream. Now, these are examples of my work. This is my earliest work, Silk Thread Martyrs. And these are from, this sample of embroidery is from Inaash, who I've worked with to develop Silk Thread Martyrs. The chest panel on the left is a kind of interpretation of a village woman's chest panel in a very political way, obviously. And this is from my last fashion, anti-fashion project, which was also an art project in a sense, called the Ceremonial Uniform. These are items from the Ceremonial Uniform that have been styled and worn and photographed in London and Beirut with different models who are friends or acquaintances. And the idea of my work as anti-fashion is that it looks at fashion as a, since I've started, I've had this very intense positive reaction to my work. But with that, there was kind of this pressure of modernizing or commercializing and creating an industry out of what I did, you know, participating in creating an industry. And I was never interested in that. I was never interested in being part of the fashion industry. I realized this very early on when I was at university. And I was never interested in creating beautiful clothes for rich, vapid fashionistas and to wear and look good in. So my work is mainly research-based and exploring the scope and breadth of Palestinian traditional techniques of dressmaking and how those can be used. I mean, if you look at Palestinian dressmaking techniques, historically, they are in a sense anti-fashion because they don't follow the economic model of fashion. So I'm looking at my work as a kind of part of that tradition. that is ongoing and that is used by Palestinians throughout the world as a means of political participation and a means of saying something first with their bodies, as a dress, and then for their cause.
Well, thank you so much for this answer. And I think this leads into, for people who are not familiar with Palestinian embroidered dress, even though I don't think there's a lot of that, can you give the audience your view of the history of Palestinian embroidered dress so that we can start the conversation and lead into your book, on the book that you took part in on embroideries? But I think in the beginning, an introduction, and how did you become interested in it? You mentioned your great aunt, but if you can tell us more about that history.
Okay. Oh, it's worth saying that my great aunt had nothing to do with embroidery. She was a very pragmatic woman who was actually had a very hard life, and the frivolity of embroidery had nothing to do with her life except as her dress. So her approach to embroidery was probably more practical and immediate as a daily practice that is inalienable from her life, versus mine, which was kind of a reconciliation and adoption of that tradition, which is the case with many Palestinians working in this field now. Yeah. But that will become clearer through the history of embroidery. So this is just a general two maps. The first on the right is from Maha Sakka, who is a collector and an activist who's dedicated her life really for Palestinian textiles and costume and embroidery. And she created this political map which shows the different styles of dress from different regions. And if you look at the map next to it, which is an old antique map of Palestine, probably before 48 and even earlier, probably 1920s, if not earlier, it shows Palestine as the area east and west of the River Jordan. And this explains really why there are so many styles that are similar between modern day Jordan and Palestine. And as well as, I mean, this map doesn't show it, but you can talk about Bedouin styles, which had a much broader scope because Bedouins were not limited to a village like villages, but had a kind of different approach to the land and belonging than villagers had. So just keep that in mind, bear that in mind. And you can go to the web. I've listed the websites of people I think are important and links that are worth looking at. So go check out their websites if you have time and if you're interested. And you can buy this poster, by the way. So Palestinian embroidery really is an aspect of Palestinian dress, and it's the dress of the rural peoples of Palestine, which were villagers and Bedouins. And it was kind of used as a technique mainly for embellishment, but also often for construction. And what we mean by embroidery is the decorative stitch work. So it can be functional or purely decorative. And mainly women's wear. So mainly village women and Bedouin women. And here I'm showing images from the Palestine Exploration Fund in London. And I really like to just position, when we talk about embroidery, it's very important to remember that this is a craft and a tradition that has been developed by people, mainly by women. It's a female-led tradition, and it was made and developed for the actual wearer. Unlike it is today, where it is made by someone for someone else and so forth, and you really don't know who made it. There was that immediacy in terms of intimacy towards the textile and the craft, sort of an embodied craft for your body itself to wear. So it's a reflection of your skill on your body. And it's also worth mentioning that townswomen, urban women, did not wear embroidery. At least that's the case in the early 20th century, late 19th century, where most of the women saw, urban and upper class women saw embroidery as a kind of peasant and Bedouin tradition that they actively dissociated from and adopted more Western or Ottoman styles. And then you had men who generally did not have embroidered dress, But they did wear embroidered goods, and there are some garments that were embroidered for men and some by men, but these are very special cases that I will talk about very briefly. So just to give everyone an idea, I will go through these following slides to show the different kinds of embroidery. So this is what the embroidery looks like. I will go through the slides and I'll choose one to perhaps talk about in depth. This is from Bethlehem on the right, and on the left from Bir al-Saba, south of Palestine, Bedouin. Then you have a child's bisht, which is a boy's bisht. It's embroidered, lightly embroidered. You see, that's the difference between men and women. If you did find embroidery on men's clothing, it was very sparse and minimal. Whereas you see this celebratory chest panel and yoke from a village woman's dress in the Jaffa area, possibly Beit Dajan, it's very heavily embroidered and colored. And then you have, for example, on the left here, you have a Bedouin example of the use of embroidery on the burqa, which was a form of face cover and face decoration that had a kind of social and spiritual function to it. You have many trinkets and talismans incorporated into the like the beads and so forth. The chains, by the way, were used to braid in the hair, and the hair was shown braided. So the idea of modesty and covering is completely different than what it is today. And the essence of modesty was control over the body and the self. That was the kind of how people communicated modesty. And then you have here on the left a shinyar, which is the embroidered back panel of a dress from the Hebron area, probably Dura, one of the Dura villages. Dura has, like, I think about 90 satellite villages around it. This is the south of Palestine, very heavy, very thick embroidery. And on the right is a waistcoat for a boy again. If you notice, boys were, could wear more decorative garments than grown men. This seems to be something that reappears constantly when you're doing research. And this is more of an Ottoman style, whereby it's most likely that this waistcoat was embroidered by a professional embroiderer, and it was most likely worn in the north of Palestine. This is another example of couching embroidery on applique, velvet applique. This would be a kind of epaulette that would come on the shoulder of the dress. And to the right is an example of a coat dress, a gilet, a kind of a very dressy coat that you would wear over an underdress. And these went out of style in the 1920s, 1930s. Sheila Weir, in her book Palestinian Costume, discusses this and why it happened, and mainly, again, issues of modesty. And then eventually, so all these examples are from basically pre-1948, before Palestine ceased to exist in the kind of global hegemonic narrative and stopped being acknowledged as a country, and upon the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, after the dispossession of nearly 1 million Palestinians, which we call a Nakba, the catastrophe. So after 1948, you had a mixture of modernity, which is another word for capitalism, and you had also aggressive colonial practices, which were, which Palestine was under. And since then, the whole approach to embroidery changed and dress changed, like everyone else around the world. Once people stopped being producing growing and making their life, they started working, selling their labor to create, to accumulate wealth, and then they would buy their clothing. So gradually the embroidery and traditional dress went out of use, and also because of the dispossession and the occupation and colonialism that Zionist Israel basically practiced against, and still practices against, Palestinians. So as a response to that, as a kind of way of resistance, a lot of Palestinians started to adopt the traditional dress and symbols of traditional dress. Tina Sherwell-Melhi talks has a very interesting article about this, how Palestinian artists, especially after the occupation of the remainder of Palestine in 1967, from, basically Israel took over from Jordan, it was impossible and illegal to show the colors of Palestinian flag or any symbols of Palestinian statehood or nationhood. And so artists started to incorporate, to use images of the Palestinian villager woman, especially, as a symbol and as a reference to Palestine in her traditional dress. And at the same and later on, around the time of the first Intifada, charities, embroidery charities, which also emerged after 1948 as a kind of response to the poverty and dispossession that occurred, as a way to enable women to sell their embroidery work as a means of income generation. And for example, this dress on the left from the Wadad Qawar collection is called an Intifada dress, or a flag dress. I don't know when this was created. The book was published in 1989, so it could be very well around the same time. And then on the left, you see examples of the use of Palestinian dress and embroidery in art by different Palestinian artists. Now, it's worth talking about the main names in this lineage of knowledge. And to the people I owe basically my my knowledge, and these are Wadad Kamel Kawar and Sheila Weir. They're the two main and principal authorities on Palestinian traditional dress and costume. Wadad Qawar started collecting very early on in her youth, Palestinian dress and Arab dress as well. And Sheila Weir started in the 1960s to research and write about Palestinian dress and textile. And between them, and they have worked together, and you can see a lot of overlaps between their work. Obviously different approaches, different disciplines, but the two between them have kind of created, along with many other women and individuals who have contributed this, but Wadad Qawar's collection and her intimate knowledge of textiles is, like, her collection is one of the biggest in the region. And Sheila Weir's work is the only scholarly work on the topic. Now, there are articles, texts, and recent works, but nothing comes close to the work of these two women. The rest of the people mentioned here are also people I have been influenced by or think their work is important. I don't necessarily agree with all they say, but I think that their work is significant and very important and worth note. If you're interested in this field, it's worth going and talking to them. And I mentioned the embroiderers, who are often, not as highlighted as individual pioneers in this field, because they're seen as simply, workers. And we'll come back to that later. And I'd like to talk about some contemporary use of embroidery with some of my colleagues. There is a very interesting and very talented artist, designer called Haytham Charles Haddad from Haifa. He has a studio called Manjaniq, which means catapult. You can go to his website. The link is here. And he actually did a project for the Young Artist of the Year Award in 2018 that looked at embroidery as in a kind of, if I understand the project correctly, dystopian reality in the future, whereby the use of, again, national symbols was illegal, so people were kind of subversively, he imagined that subversively embroidering their body as a kind of comment, or as a kind of act of political participation and resistance, which is very interesting because it's very similar to the original practice whereby you embroidered your dress, which was yours and yours alone, and the intimacy was almost immediate, versus what is the, but his take is more, he's got a very interesting take on it. You can go to his website and read more about it. You also have Majd Abdel Hamid, who is also an artist. Majd has been working with embroidery for years. We went to school together, actually. And then we became friends. And Majd uses embroidery in a very a traditional way. So he uses different materials and different surfaces. For example, here he's using a tea strainer. And this is a project about Palmyra and Tadmor. And so he doesn't only limit his work to Palestine, but uses these traditional techniques from Palestine and works with Palestinian embroiderers as well, and as a language of expression and political participation again. One of his earlier works for the Young Artist of the Year award in 2010, I believe, was a kind of a pop art interpretation of Bouazizi's face, the man who self-emulated in Tunis and basically sparked the revolution there. And he did a homage to him using, embroidering his face into a portrait, like, referencing again a pop culture. What's his name? The guy with the white hair. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Andy Warhol, of course, the guy with the white hair. And then there's Natalie Tahan, who also went to London College of Fashion as myself. We never met there, but she came after me. And she has a more kind of practical or fashion-based approach, which takes the different patterns from Palestinian regions and turns them into a print, and makes these, and has made a collection of them called Prints of Palestine. This is the Ramallah one. She has other works and projects, and it's also worth seeing her work and supporting her because she's doing something very interesting. And although there's no needlework in there, it still kind of looks at this tradition in a more, in a different and dynamic way that is not only limited to embroidery as stitch work itself. And so, yeah, this is basically it. This is obviously not the concise history. It took me years to kind of figure out because there's not much work on this, and it's worth, everyone should do and conduct their own research, I think.
Yeah, well, but this is a wonderful introduction for the broad audience we have. There's close to 200 people in this group, yes. And so that was a good way to bring everyone together to the next stage of the conversation, which is your own work with embroiderers. As you've mentioned, like I've seen that you've put the name of some embroiderers in your list. You also, in your own practice, for example, in your project, the Silk Threads Martyrs, for example, that short is made of pin cushions that are embroidered. You've worked with martyrs, especially in Lebanon. Can you talk to us about your experience working with embroiderers, and can you talk about that responsibility in the relationship between the designer and the embroiderer in a tradition such as the Palestinian embroidery?
Yes, I can do that, yes. So basically, this whole thing started in 2005, I think. My mother went to Lebanon and came back with this shawl, which is on the left, and it's still here. It's a Najaf embroidered shawl, Najaf is basically a camel or goat wool or a mix of both that comes from Iraq. It's a narrow weave, hand woven on traditional looms. And in Ash in Beirut, Ash is the Association for the Development of Palestinian Camps in Lebanon. They've decided to use that material and create shawls. And before 2005, I was never interested in embroidery as a kind of career trajectory or as a kind of field of interest. You do see it around you, but you don't really, know what it's all about, and you don't really know the scope. This is something very important to comment on. If you're Palestinian living in Palestine or anywhere else, this aspect of your culture is not immediately apparent to you. We don't know this. We don't know the variety that exists in our history. We don't know the techniques. We know very little, and it's usually a very kind of reduced interpretation of what Palestinian embroidery looks like, which is basically just a cross stitch and red and black and white. And that's nonsense. That's a very diluted aspect of a very long-standing and rich culture. So I saw this shawl, and I was actually shocked. I was actually preparing to study biological sciences and was accepted in 5 different universities to do that. But I had always had this tendency or interest in making or how things work. So I've been making candles for about 20 years now, and design has always been something interesting to me. That's why I was interested in biology, because it's all about how things work, and you can recreate that. So that, with a combination of other effects, basically pushed me to apply for a foundation degree at Camberwell College of Art. And from there, basically, in parallel to what they taught me, try and research and study Palestinian dressmaking techniques from Palestine, like rural Palestinian dressmaking techniques. And there was nobody to really, like, there was no discipline. There still isn't a discipline around. And I think this is good, because it's also, you don't want someone to come and tell you this is right and this is wrong. But there wasn't a kind of any easily accessible body of work that, or avenues that could give you a good understanding of what Palestinian traditional dress looked like, besides the works of the people I mentioned above. But those were, you know, a few and far between. So I started to look independently. This wasn't great for my grades, by the way. But anyway, so In'ash kind of started this instigated this interest. And so when I became a student at London College of Fashion, I went back in 2009 and did my internship there. And with them, I worked on, you know, learning, first of all, about embroidery and how they embroider and their kind of the technical aspect. I've always been more interested in the technical and the design aspect than the kind of romantic, empty talk that kind of really always surrounds embroidery. You know, I'm more interested in how is this a real craft? How can we work with it? What does it mean? What do people, you know, what do people feel? What do they do? All that, you know, the interesting part about something that you can take and use and incorporate into your life, not just romanticize about it endlessly. Okay. So with In'ash, I worked on several things, mainly my final graduation collection at London College of Fashion. You can see an example of that on the right. This is a shirt embroidered by Samira Nasser, who's a Palestinian woman, probably second or probably third generation refugee living in Lebanon. And the cushion on the left, I have a terrible time saying left and right, sorry. On the left is a cushion from the series Cushionania by In'ash, which they did for their 50th anniversary this year. It was supposed to launch as a big event, but all got bungled because of the pandemic. So, and I've had this very formative relationship with In'ash, where they have not only accepted me and helped me with my work, but also shown me the value of embroidery as work. And they've showed me the kind of the problems that workers and embroiderers have in the charity context, and the challenges that Lebanese women have working in Lebanon, Palestinian refugee women working in Lebanon, because basically if you're a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, you're barred from a number of professions, about 70 or more. That means that your access to social mobility, wealth, and, you know, self-determination is virtually zero. So In'ash provides this work for the refugee women because they see it as a way of reconnecting them to Palestine, at the same time as creating, In'ash means revival. Now, I fundamentally disagree with the idea of revival, because I don't think that it has ever died, that it requires revival. It's just that embroidery has changed and morphed into different things. And so, so that's basically how it all started with In'ash, really. And it still carries on.
I think I want to follow up on the question with your own work with sort of the refugees of the Marlias camp in Lebanon, and sort of that relationship, the responsibility between the designer and the embroiderers. I think, you know, one of the things that are unique about your work that, you know, we're very interested in is sort of you're trying to bring the craftspeople, those wonderful women who are doing the embroidery to the forefront. So can you tell us about your relationship with them? And yeah.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, so I'm not an activist. I'm not someone who's an activist, and I don't want to be seen as someone who's trying to do this because, you know, it's a very, it's a touchy subject, and, you know, there are a lot of posers around pretending to help people through these schemes. And it's worth acknowledging that I am the primary benefactor from these relationships. Like, as you can, I'm the one here talking to you online. I'm the one in the British Museum. I'm the one who's being written about in the press. Now, this is not a problem only designers have to face and be responsible for, but this is a cultural problem whereby labor or work is seen as a kind of unimportant or secondary to the idea. So the designer, the artist, the thinker, etc., is always celebrated as the kind of the hero or the primary element in the creative process, which I think is not true. Because knowing from my experience, it's impossible for me to create this work. I can imagine it, I can design it, I can draw it, I can embroider a little, but it's impossible for me to create what I have created without collaborating and working with, and basically exploiting the labor of professional embroiderers. Now, exploitation here is in the capitalist sense, whereby labor is always exploitative. I am a firm believer of that. And that is, and the question, and so the problem here is not about just representation, because when I started discussing this issue with other people, like, because there's this anxiety in Palestine and amongst Palestinians abroad about the extinction of Palestinian embroidery and extinction of Palestinian dressmaking techniques. And it's always about preservation, revival, etc. But everyone stops short of actually making the profession a viable one, economically and commercially, okay, and in terms of labor. So if embroidery and dressmaking techniques from Palestine, including weaving and etc., dyeing and so forth, is that important, then if we are serious about it as a society, we have to think about, you know, about how do we make it something that is inseparable from our, you know, from our lives and is viable to our, you know, as work, not as something that you do only when you're a refugee or as a last, you know, recourse. And this is what it is at the moment. So it's either you are an upper class woman or an activist who has love for embroidery and wants to help by setting up a charity or coming up with or a designer coming up with a kind of a production line, or you're an Israeli company in Tel Aviv exploiting Palestinian work in the camps in Bethlehem. Okay, so and then people get crazy about, you know, Israeli companies taking that work and using it, but then we're not providing any alternatives. So a lot of embroiderers, especially in Lebanon, see this work as work. Okay, and I think that is the case in Palestine now. For a lot of people who are on the outside, or, you know, middle class, upper class, people who don't really do embroidery or work in embroidery, they have a romantic and political position whereby, you know, this is our tradition, it shouldn't be handed over, the people who produce it have a love for it. And no, a lot of the producers see it as work. They don't care who they're producing it for. The problem is they're stuck. They cannot say anything, they cannot resist, they cannot organize, and so forth. And so it comes down to a collective movement that if we are serious about our crafts as traditions that should be used by all Palestinians to the benefit of all Palestinians, we should rethink the economic structure and the production of, the relations of production. Again, going back to anti-fashion, fashion is a mode of production. Embroidery currently is a mode of production. It's labor. And Rachel Dedman talks about this in her exhibition, A Labor of Love. She addresses this issue. Very few people have addressed this issue or see this issue as an issue of labor and exploitation. But I think that for this tradition, for this skill to remain as significant as we want it to be, we have to completely rehaul the economic makeup of how it goes about happening. And that includes exhibitions, that includes museums, that includes collections, that includes everything. So it's an entire rethinking of how we approach and talk about embroidery from Palestine. Because it's the people who matter, the ones who make it and use it. And, it's not just used as a kind of decoration, but it is our, there is a very intimate relationship. It is a craft that is a tool for self-realization. And when that traditional self-realization becomes corrupted and co-opted into these kind of purely superficial and cynical endeavors that seek to generate income at the expense of Palestinians, especially when they are used and appropriate, well, not only appropriated, dispossessed from Palestinians by Israeli companies and Israeli designers. By the way, this is something I haven't talked about a lot, and I thought it wasn't a serious threat until recently. So we have to, and it's because, sorry to interrupt you, because we insist on Israel as being the primary culprit. But Israel is a colonial entity, This is the nature of the beast. They are going to come and exploit, extract, and take, dispossess. Now, it falls to us to kind of counter that by looking at embroidery, not from the same, not just against dispossession and colonialism in the traditional sense, but as a kind of, from the economic lens.
Mm-hmm. You know what, Omar, this is sort of, I'm reminded while you speak about the relationship between art makers and art designers throughout history. I don't think this is a new thing, this big question of who, in a sense, who is the artist and who gets the intellectual property? Is it the person who makes, the maker of the object, or is it the person who dictates the ideas of the design? So this is a very long discursive tradition of questioning who is the artist in these questions. I think because of the time limitation, I want us to move to the book that you recently published, the 17 Embroidery Techniques from Palestine. I'd like us to spend some time talking about that, because I think it is a wonderful sort of product to share with the audience here, and maybe we'll come to these questions back in the question answer period.
Yes, we can do that, but I just want to say the thing about that discussion about whether the artist or the creator, I mean, I think it's both. This is very easy to answer. There is this kind of liberal, wishy-washy, silly, this kind of, it's been going on for a long time, and this is going on for 400 years since capitalism started to become the global economic model in its many manifestations and similarities and dissimilarities. So I think this issue of the division of labor is not, it's not down to us to solve, but we should be aware of it. And I think the first step is to acknowledge that the same way that an embodied idea, the idea that comes authentically or through research and self-development, that comes to the designer or the artist, the same thing is true for this embodied skill of the artisan or the craftsperson, or who used to be called the artists themselves back before art got differentiated into this, ephemeral, wishy-washy subject that anyone can claim to be. So it's really a very easy answer, because you need both. You can't produce anything if you don't have a worker, and you can't produce anything if you don't have the idea. So I think if we stop beating around the bush and address the issue honestly, we can start finding, I believe, answers. Now, the book, so the book started in 2010. The book, which is basically a manual, it's not really a book, called 17 Embroidery Techniques from Palestine, an instruction manual, is a bilingual instruction manual that was conceived by Tanya Tamari Nasser. Now, for full disclosure, she is my great aunt, and she has also been an influence in my life on embroidery and aesthetics and music. So she had written a book in the, I think, 1980, I can't remember. It's late 20th century, late last century. Okay, last quarter of last century. It's wonderful you can say this now, last century. And it was a book that she co-wrote with Widad Ka'war called Traditional Palestinian Fallahi Embroidery, that concentrated on the different motifs and motif arrangements of cross-stitch embroidery from the different parts of Palestine. And it was intended as a kind of sample book for embroiderers in Palestine and outside to look at as a kind of example to copy and to invent more, rearrange these motifs from what they saw. And each section was basically, devoted to a different region, like Ramallah, Hebron, Jaffa, Gaza, etc. So these regions, although they are problematic because they rely on a kind of mandate division, but they generally base themselves on a kind of town centers, so like commerce centers where people would converge. And then you have a regional style developing from that, whereupon in each village you have very particular nuances, and then from one person to another you have individual uniqueness. So if you look at historic dress from Palestine, unless the dress was really made as a copy, you would never find two dresses looking the same, because they were made by different people and made as individual objects to be worn and to celebrate the uniqueness and independence of the person making them. So 17, this book was basically intended as a sequel. Tanya Tamari Nasser wanted it to be a kind of complementary, she thought that there were so many stitches that were worked on, that were used in Palestine, but have not been spoken of, highlighted or celebrated as much as cross stitch. So she partnered up with Sumbula, which is a fair trade craft platform. It's an charity again. And their role is to basically market and promote the work of different women and craft organizations and charities in Palestine, throughout Palestine. And whilst making sure that their work is ethical, okay? And so, and to do so, they actually send, they work in partnership with these organizations to help them with presentation, product development, and marketing, which is the most essential thing, because you have all these ridiculous United Nations and NGO projects that come in. They've been happening forever, since Oslo, since 1993, like these development projects that always come in and give training courses and teach, but never offer a real concrete, a viable economic solution. So can you sell your work? Can you source your products? And can you actually ensure continuity of quality? And Sumbula does that. Sumbula comes in and tries to remedy, and has successfully done so against all the odds. I mean, I talk about my criticism of charities, but I think that there are, like In'ash and Sumbula and many others, despite my belief that charities shouldn't exist because we should have a better economic system that's just and fair, that doesn't require, individual initiatives to help people who need that help, but it's the collective responsibility. I think that charities in Palestine and abroad, and especially in this field, they kind of address a very real need, like in Ash al-Usra in Ramallah al-Bihri. Okay, they have established another embroidery workshop that has actually made a huge significant difference in the economics life of many of their embroiderers and workers. So anyway, so this book, you can find it on Sumbula. You can go to their website, go support them. This is Christmas, they need the support. And it was, so it started 2010. I was approached because of my work on Silk Thread Martyrs and because I was someone who came from a design background. So my skill was, I was, a person of interest, if you want, because my approach to embroidery was not just aesthetic or romantic or conceptual, it was actually structural, and I wanted to understand and use the techniques. So we were then, so we started with the Birzeit University collection. The idea was to go to the Birzeit University collection and look at the different examples of embroidery, identify them, and try and work out how they were made. So my role was to look and identify different styles. So from the very beginning, there was a kind of, and this is worth mentioning, that this is not cross-stitch, okay? These are different techniques altogether. And in this book, we've identified 17, and we discuss each, individually. But anyway, before that, so we had to, identify these stitches and eventually recreate them and deconstruct them and analyze them to be able to illustrate them, give instructions, and present them in this manual for use. And for that, we had to work with, it's worth mentioning, to work with Sabha Abu Ali from Yatta and Julia Boutros from Beit Jala. Now, the woman who has been leading Sumbula through, as they say, through good and bad and through everything, is Shirabi Yamada, who is a Japanese woman who, for I don't know what reason, drove her to come to Palestine and dedicate her life to this. But without her, this would not have been possible. Okay, so this is something I forgot to mention before, but it was Shirabi's kind of overarching commitment, drive, and ruthlessness, basically, because I'm very lax in my work, that made this project happen. So Shirabi basically took us around. We went to Yatta in the south of Palestine. Took us about 3 hours to get to Sabha's house, met her mother, discussed the project, showed her some images that we had, and she was like, yeah, okay, I can, I know what these are. And sure enough, she managed to break down almost all the stitches that we presented her with. And in that process, I would film her breaking down each, recreating the stitch, embroidering, and she would give me instructions. She would tell me how to do it, and I would go back and try to deconstruct this. So, just generally before I continue, it's worth noting that there are generally, after what we've seen, there are two types of embroidery. There is the purely aesthetic, decorative, and then there is the functional, which is also decorative. So embroidery is all decorative stitchwork again. And for example, here you see these joining stitches. This is a zigzag joining stitch, a manjal halal from Heaven and Hell dress in Tubas, from Tubas, north of Ramallah, around Nablus and Jenin. And on the left is a detail from a dress from Bethlehem. I think it's Tob Khdari or Malak Abu Wardi, I'm not sure. But basically it's one of the more, the richer styles of and more kind of luscious and luxurious dresses of the South. And it's you have here a plate joining stitch. This is what we found out it's called by looking at Gillian Fogelsang Eastwood's Encyclopedia of Embroidery from the Arab World. And basically, you have here a different kind of surface embroidery, which is decorative. Like, for example, on the right here, you have a detail from a dress from Kawkaba or Hlikat, which is in the south of Palestine. And you can see, for example, there's cross stitch, stem stitch in the center, and then you have satin stitch and a kind of interlaced cross stitch. On the left, you have the front of a Galilee durra, a Galilee coat, which would have been worn over an underdress and trousers. And you have this kind of, you have cross stitch here, and some, I can't discern this one here, but you have these kind of skipping back stitch. You see these little dots, these running stitches. It's a style of, I've called it a skipping back stitch, whereby it's a kind of stitch that goes through 2 layers of fabric. It's like a basting or a stay stitch, okay, that creates a thicker fabric that could be worn inside or out. You can see, you know, on the inside is just as pretty as the outside. And I don't know if I have more. And then you have, for example, this dress from the south of Palestine, from the Hebron, again, Dura area. And this entire dress, you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 techniques of embroidery. So besides the chest panel, which is cross-stitch embroidered decoratively, you have like the herringbone stitch along the sleeves that is used to cover the seams. You have joining stitches, you have applique zigzag stitch, you have interlaced cross stitch, which is used as a finishing stitch along the collar and the neck opening. And so the book looks at all these different stitches and tries to, you know, differentiate them and show them in context. So to do that, we had to spend like 9 years of research, which was intermittent, granted. We had to stop for 3 years because of a crisis Simbula was going through, and then we resumed. But it also took this long because none of us had actually done anything like this before. This was a completely new project, which, you know, none of us had created a manual for embroidery before, and never has there been any work that concentrates exclusively on techniques of embroidery. You have many publications and works that talk about the names of them, like The Treasury of Motifs by Margarita Skinner and Wadad Qawar, that talks about the different names of motifs. This was about how to embroider the different techniques found on dress from Palestine, historic Palestine. And so because of that ignorance, you know, definitely on my part, like I was completely illiterate in what I was doing. It was also, we tried to kind of, how do you say, use it to our benefit, because we were coming to this as complete outsiders. And so what we produced, we tried to produce the most detailed and broken down analysis and step-by-step instruction for someone who is similarly, you know, just as ignorant of these techniques as we were, especially as I was. And so the intention of this is to look at every kind of possible nuance and particularity that would help the, you know, the untrained eye or even the trained eye in understanding how these stitches work. And some of them, for example, like the Manjal Ghazawi or the knotted joining stitch from Gaza, that was one of the most difficult ones to illustrate, because this is a kind of joining stitch that follows the same principle as all the joining stitches, but in between each part there's a kind of a break, and these aesthetic, like purely decorative bone-shaped stitches are, you know, created. And so obviously we couldn't unravel the original examples of embroidery, because usually that's the easiest way to understand an embroidery, by looking at the back and unraveling it. So it was very, very challenging to find the best way to communicate that to someone who doesn't understand embroidery. Eventually we, because you can see, like in Fogelsang's, Eastwood Fogelsang's book, you have in the appendix an illustration of the different techniques of embroidery, brilliantly illustrated, very concise, showing you the movement, the movement that you have to do, and the back and the front of it in a very clever design way. But we wanted to do something that was kind of an idiot-proof book that could work on, if it could work on me, we would, we'd hope it works on someone else. And so this was also accompanied by written instructions in Arabic and in English, and as well as a kind of isolated example of the embroidery pictured and shown on the back and the front. So you can see, for example, here on the right, you have instructions for couching. So it shows you how to actually position the thread, how to, all these different tricks that we learned from Julia, for example, Julia Boutros in Bejala. And then you have on the left, another page from the patchwork instruction section. And this is a preceding section to the actual instructions, whereby we kind of give a small profile of each stitch. So, a general broad introduction of where it was used, how it was used, why it was used, and examples of original, from original dresses at the Birzeit University collection. And then for the actual instructions, we would isolate it to show the back in the most clear way possible. And so, yeah, that's basically the book. I mean, if I've missed anything, maybe you can ask me about it if you'd like to know more. But I mean, other than the people mentioned, this is worth mentioning again, since it's in the spirit of the previous question. Other than the people mentioned here and on the cover, this book was kind of a group effort. I mean, there were translators like Ruba Hassan and our editor, Nasser-Khoury, my English teacher at school, Don Hutchison. He gave us feedback. I mean, they were also in Ash al-Usra. Research was conducted at the British Museum. This was not a kind of a 3-person or a 4-person project, or, it was a collective, it was almost like a community project that we had to, it was not anthropological. It was not in the sense of, strictly scientific, but it was a kind of, we learned as we went along. I mean, if you ask any of the participants, I hope some of them are watching today, the stress, and then there's Dina Khalil, of course, who designed the book, yes. Dina Khalil is the granddaughter of Samiha Khalil, founder of Inash al-Usra. So there's a very kind of familial sense and a kind of personal attachment to this project, in the sense that it's our work, it's our history, family histories, family sensitivities, and also this collective sense of doing something for Palestine and the tradition of Palestinian textiles.
Thank you so much, Omar. I'm looking at the screen and thinking of the, as you said, the pioneers who started the work on documenting Palestinian embroidery and brought them into all our lives. People my generation grew up with the names of Widad Qawar and Tanya Tamari Nasser and others, and definitely Inash al-Usra. But what I'll do now is I'll thank you so much for bringing also the new generation and people who are taking that tradition forward, and the workers who did that tradition. And with that, I will pass the mic back to Fahmida for the question answers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Omar, I just wanted to thank you so much for such an engaging talk, for being so honest, and for sharing so much of your practice. And of course, for Ruba, thank you for leading such an amazing conversation.